Good day, everyone. My name is Sebastian Spiteri. I'm a Master's in Management student at London Business School, and one of the co-organizers of the Global Energy Summit this year. This year, we have over 800 registered attendees from over 67 countries. We're very glad to have you all with us today. Today, we'll be discussing how the global energy transition is impacting the Middle East and the changes that are taking place in the region. We have a Q&A box open throughout the event. Please post your questions in the Q&A for the Q&A sessions following both the keynote and the panel. Rusha Al-Rawaf will be moderating today's event. Rusha is the Corporate Communications Director at Aramco Europe and is a current LBS student in the Executive MBA program. She's a leadership and organizational consultant with versatile experience in cross-functional and cross-cultural environments, with over 15 years of experience in the energy sector. Please join me in welcoming Rusha. Rusha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our guests from around the globe, and welcome to day 2 of the London Business School Global Energy Forum. During last year's Climate Ambition Summit, which marked the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, it was revealed that countries representing around 65% of global CO2 emissions and around 70% of the world's economy have committed to net zero emissions or carbon neutrality. With this goal in mind and COP26 taking place in Glasgow in this November, the energy transition is central to any discourse on energy, and the Middle East is no exception. Which brings us to our session today on the transition of energy in the Middle East. Some housekeeping information for our virtual session today. We have an exciting lineup of speakers for you. The session will be broken down into 2 segments. We will first start with the keynote speaker, followed by Q&A from the audience. So start submitting your questions through the platform. This will last for approximately 30 minutes. And then we'll follow up with the roundtable discussion with 3 experts from the energy sector, followed by our second audience Q&A. This segment will last for a total of 45 minutes. Our keynote speaker for this evening joins us from Kuwait, Sheikh Nawaf Al-Sabah, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Kuwait Petroleum International and Kuwait Foreign Petroleum Exploration Company. Prior to his 2013 appointment as CEO, he spent 14 years in Kuwait Petroleum heading several leadership positions within the company, including Principal In-House Counsel. Sheikh Nawaf, a graduate of Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School for Public and International Affairs, also received his Doctorate of Law degree from Harvard University. Please help me welcome Sheikh Nawaf Al-Sabah to the virtual stage to talk about energy transition and shifts in the geopolitical landscape.
Thank you, Rusha, for a nice introduction. Welcome to everyone who is joining virtually around the world. And what a year it has been since you had your last summit, and also how we have all progressed over the past year. In fact, my children were showing me today photos of what we were doing exactly a year ago, and that was skiing in Austria. Little did we know that we were 1 town away from one of the epicenters of COVID transmission in Europe. So what's happened over the past year, and where are we going? I think this is a good time in the middle of a pandemic to pause, take stock of where we are, and anticipate where we will be in the next few years. First, we should start with where were we before the pandemic started? We had $60 oil, more or less. We had 100 million barrel a day oil market that was relatively well functioning. And by relatively well functioning, I can point to a couple of things. One, as Rusha just mentioned, we had the Paris climate agreement that mandated, for obvious reasons, limits and reductions ultimately to CO2 emissions. That threatened also, by many analysts' predictions, the future of the internal combustion engine, the oil economies of the Gulf region and other places around the world. But at the same time, you had a security issue that came up with the attack on the largest export facility of the world's largest producer of oil, Saudi Arabia, the attack on a gig. It happened on a Friday, and luckily oil markets were closed Saturday and Sunday. But by the time oil markets opened on Monday, you saw an increase in the oil price of only about 10 to 15%, and that only lasted about a day or two till things moved back to where they were price-wise. Why was that? It was because the market was, as I said, relatively well-functioning and well-supplied. Also because of the tremendous efforts that Aramco did to bring production back online very quickly, and also because the rest of the producers in the Gulf, KPC in Kuwait, ADNOC in the UAE, and others, other major producers, were ready to step in and make sure that the world was well supplied with oil as it needed to be. So that showed that we had a market that worked and a system that worked relatively well. And then COVID arrived. And when that did, it coupled with a political rivalry that played out into the oil market, leading to an oversupply of oil, just as the demand was collapsing due to obvious restrictions on travel and a general slowdown in the economy. So we saw from there a period of negative oil prices for a short period of time, and that was all very important because it was the first time that we saw that in the history of the oil market. Demand collapsed, but at the same time, we saw a resilience as well, just as we saw the resilience of the market after a gig. We saw the resilience of OPEC working with its partners under what ultimately became OPEC plus, if you will, that included all the major oil producers around the world, to put a rein on this oversupply, bring the market relatively back to stability, and that has worked so far. You've seen now, as we approach the one-year anniversary now of the major lockdowns that happened around the world, you see an oil price that is recovered now to slightly over $60. And now, just today, I saw a piece by Woodmac asking the question about whether we will enter into a super spike period of oil prices where oil price will jump quite high. I don't believe we're on the cusp of right now, but there is an issue dealing with the massive underinvestment that went on over the past year in oil production. And I'll get to that in a minute, but how that will play out over the future and how the oil market will react and with respect to underinvestment, and at the same time, challenges on the future of demand and whether we have peaked in terms of demand or not. And it's about every decade or so, we get into, we get ourselves very excited about a new theory. If you remember, about 20 years ago, we were talking about peak supply. That's it. There's no more supply coming out of the out of the Gulf. It's all peaked, and how will we meet the rising demand? Now you're talking about a potential peak in demand. A few years ago, it was a different story. All of those are Chicken Little, the sky is falling. But right now, I would posit that we are in a position where there are challenges to the oil market. There are challenges to the Gulf countries and the economies of the Gulf. But these are not insurmountable challenges, and they are, I'll explain in a minute, how I think, and we think at KPC and the Kuwaiti oil sector, that we're well positioned to capture the opportunities coming into the future. So I'll start with where the geopolitics now puts us with respect to the position of the markets and the Paris Agreement and potential net zero carbon emissions. So we'll start off very quickly, very easily with a change of US administration. That will have a fundamental change, not only in the foreign policy of the United States, but also in its energy policy. We rarely see major shifts in US policy as we have seen from the Trump administration coming in and now leaving and being replaced by the Biden administration. And we see that first is the United States, after the last 4 years of having a very active participation and concentration on the Gulf, going to revert to the Obama administration's position, which was a pivot away from the Middle East towards China in terms of a strategic relationship. That has a lot of connotations and implications on the Gulf, and it will reflect into the geopolitics of the region and ultimately into the energy mix and the energy markets around the world. By the same token, is the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal, going to be resurrected in a certain way? You've seen the President of the United States say that sanctions will not be lifted on Iran until it does abide by the nuclear deal. And the Iranians saying on the other side, they want sanctions lifted before they revert to the nuclear deal. And there is a bit of the chicken and egg scenario that will have to resolve itself politically somehow. But in the meantime, we're looking in the Gulf at where US policy, where world policy is looking at and where the emphasis is coming from. You saw President Biden's first major foreign policy speech talk about the role the US wants to play in the region, which is to try to resolve and end conflicts as quickly as possible. And you're seeing some of that play out right now in how the Kuwaiti mediation of the Gulf dispute helped resolve that, and other conflicts being resolved on a rather quicker timescale than we would have foreseen even very recently. Looking a little bit further out, as you see where that pivot is, and you look towards the east, you start to see a new energy paradigm, and if I'm going to use Dan Yergin's phrase, a new energy map unfolding around the world. And that is, when you look to the east, you start seeing a potential replacement of the so-called petrostates, typically the Gulf states, that rely quite significantly on petroleum reserves and income from those reserves to fund their economies, to what are now starting to be called electrostates. If the world is moving towards a net zero economy with greater emphasis on electrification of the vehicle fleet and manufacturing as well, you're going to see a premium on all components of the electric industry. And here specifically, you're looking at batteries and the lithium and cobalt that are needed for batteries. You look at electrostates now, China being the principal one, a lot of lithium coming out of China, and a strong control of the lithium market coming from China. At the same time, cobalt really coming out from one country in Africa for the most part. Neither of those countries is going to be able to use that resource as a weapon, as had been used in the past by some oil producers as a political weapon and through embargoes and whatnot. Neither of those states as electrostates are likely to be even able to use their control of that market as a political weapon. So there's some relaxation in terms of fear of using that resource as a political weapon, as some of the fears that right now are continuing in Europe about Russian influence over especially Eastern Europe through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that will supply gas into Germany and other places in Europe. The fear now is more of an economic one, less so of a political use of resources as a weapon of international public policy. By the same token, you start to realize that China is a major consumer of oil and also a major consumer of electricity and a generator of quite a bit of CO2 emissions. How China reacts to the challenges that the Paris Agreement bring forward, and also its needs for economic development, even after this pandemic is under control, it is going to be one of the principal questions that is going to guide the next decade at least. I look at the Gulf itself and the oil market itself, and say, okay, well, with all of this happening, I still see the Gulf being central to the development of the energy economy around the world, whether that is guided by electrification or hydrocarbons. And specifically, I'll bring in a couple of points. I mentioned that the oil market required 100 million barrels a day of production just before the pandemic. Right now, it's probably about 10 million barrels off that 100 million mark. So you're talking about perhaps a 90 million barrel a day oil market. That is still a principal transportation fuel. It is still a huge component of the petrochemicals industry and manufacturing. It's not easily going to be replaced. Look at electric vehicle sales over the past number of years. I think last year, 2%. We'll take out the pandemic year. So let's talk about 2019. In 2019, you had about 2 to 3% of vehicle sales worldwide be electric vehicles. Now that was significant because it was a doubling of the number from a year or two before that. So assume that it doubles again. Perhaps after the pandemic is over, you will end up at about 4 or 5% of vehicle sales being electric. That still means 95% of vehicle sales will be the internal combustion engine, albeit with greater fuel efficiency of that engine. It then brings up the question then, okay, with the increase in electrification, how will that impact the overall demand for oil? So I mentioned a 90 million barrel a day market. Many of you will know that oil production from conventional fields decreases on a yearly basis by about 8%, 6 to 8%, let's say, on a conventional field. Let's take out from the 90 million barrels about 30 million barrels that comes out of OPEC, because principally a lot of that comes from fields that are that have long lives, that have immensely stable production numbers, and are backed up by quite significant investment. And those are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the Emirates, some other countries as well. So let's say those are not going to be decreasing at 6 to 8%. So you're still left with, call it 50 million, for lack of a better number, 50 million barrels a day that is still subject to the decline rate of about 6 to 8%. That is somewhere from 3 to 4 million barrels a day per year that will be taken off the market as supply due to natural declines in oil fields. Let me put that into context. The state of Kuwait right now produces 2.3 million barrels a day under the OPEC++ allocation. And that means you will have to replace 1 to 2 Kuwaits per year, every year going forward. That is a massive amount of oil that is going to have to be discovered and brought to market. Let's look back over the past few years. You will see that the major oil discoveries have been, for example, in Norway, Johan Sverdrup, a huge oil discovery that was in Norway that was quite large. It's going to produce, I think it's about 1 million barrels a day. That's not even enough to replace a Kuwait. And you need about 1 to 2 Kuwaits a year to be brought online. Look at other fields that are being brought online. Again, it's barely enough to to replace the declines. The world had been relying quite a bit on US shale production to replace those declines over the past number of years, especially since 2010 or so, 2011. But with the underinvestment that's gone on in shale fields in the United States, you've seen about 2 million barrels of oil production, of shale production in the United States come off the market. And that has exacerbated the issue for the supply of the market. So even if you're talking about a potential peak in demand, which I'll get to in a second, you're still seeing that supply is going to be challenged to bring to even supply the current requirements of the oil market in terms of demand. Now let's take a look at the demand side of it. The demand side, nobody's getting on an electric airplane anytime soon, once people start getting back on airplanes to begin with. But also the electric vehicle fleet is not at the tipping point or the inflection point, if you will, that will make a massive dent in oil demand. So instead, you will find that oil demand will continue to increase, perhaps at a lower rate, so about 2% a year, instead of the greater rates of about 3 to 4% that it was doing in the previous years. So if you have that into 1 to 2%, that's still about 1 million to 2 million barrels a day of net increased demand that you're going to have to find supply to fill. As that progresses, you'll probably end up at a peak sometime, but not in the next decade or so, at least until 2030. By which time most of the production of oil at 2030, because of the decline rates around the world that I just mentioned, will be coming from fields that are new, that have to be brought on sometime soon. Now, all of us in the oil industry understand that once you discover a major oil field, it takes about 7 years to bring that field onto production, online in production. And that's because you need to go through an appraisal program and then a development program and ultimately bring that field to production. It's about 7 years. So you're seeing if there is no investment being done in oil exploration and development over the past year and into this year, that somewhere 6 or 7 years from now, an additional amount of oil that the world was expecting is not going to be coming online, and that's going to cause an issue for the market and for oil producers around and consumers around the world. So where does that put us in the Gulf? It puts us in a relatively good position, albeit with quite a number of challenges to face until we get to that position. I think over the next few years, we will be extremely challenged because of the oil price, because of the lingering effects of the COVID pandemic. But then ultimately, once the world gets back to some semblance of normal, and I'll get to what we mean by normal in a minute, then we'll be in a position where the oil price will be more and more dictated by the marginal barrel coming out of the Gulf. And it's only the producers such as Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, that are making those investments right now to ensure that those barrels are made available as and when needed. That is a lot of production that needs to come online sometime soon, and it is principally these countries and others in the region that are making those investments. So we should be in a good enough position within a few years' time to capture the additional demand, and also to take advantage of a tighter oil market as the energy mix increases. And I mentioned a minute ago what life will look like in a potential new normal after COVID. I don't think anybody knows exactly what that's going to be, and I don't think anybody can accurately predict it right now. But there is going to be some change on that, and one of that is this summit and others like it would have been held in person, and people would have been flying in or coming in to attend. And we've gotten to be quite comfortable right now doing all of these out of our living rooms and our homes. When we're able to travel again, will these types of events be held in person principally, or online principally? And that is yet to be determined. Similarly, the types of mobility people will change. I've gotten used to, first of all, not getting in their cars as often because there's nowhere to go. They can't go into the offices. They can't go anywhere else. So they've gotten used to walking around the block. How will that impact mobility in the future? On the flip side of that also is where people have been able to get out of their houses recently during this pandemic. Nobody wants to take public transportation. So people are more and more relying on cars, which will to all these coins. And I don't think anybody really can accurately predict what will prevail, and we'll see how it comes out over time. So with that movement in the energy markets and the energy mix as a result of climate change, net zero policies, and the pandemic, where is the world going to be? How is the world headed, or was the world headed in terms of how to fulfill the energy requirements that are going on? Now, if you take a look at it as a rule of thumb, if the rest of the world were to demand electricity at the per capita rate that the EU uses, so if the rest of the world uses electricity at the per capita rate of the European Union, that will require a 45% increase in electrification around the world, electricity demand around the world. That is a massive increase in electricity demand. Where's that electricity going to come from? We're talking about potential increases in photovoltaics and in wind power. Now, we've seen to disastrous effects, unfortunately, what's happened in the state of Texas in the United States as a result of the way they set up their electricity grid. And Texas, by the way, had the largest wind electrification through wind of any state in the United States. And all of that collapsed when they had extremely cold temperatures and a very cold and destructive storm. So as the demand for electricity increases through electrification, through even just population increases over time, that electricity is going to have to come more and more from renewable sources. But at the same time, it might have it's going to have to also come the energy is also going to have to come from hydrogen, whether it's green or blue hydrogen, through hydroelectric. And we know what Norway's experiment with hydroelectricity is. It's about 98% of their electricity is generated through hydroelectric means. All of that makes sense for them, but how will that play out in places around the world? It's very simple for well-developed economies and those, especially in Northern Europe, for example, to pontificate about the necessity for CO2 reductions through net zero carbon emissions for their economies. That's all well and good, but how does that play out in places like India, Africa, even China and Southeast Asia, that respond by saying, you've had your chance to develop, it's our responsibility now to develop our economies, and we can't do it solely through maintenance of net zero. Take a look at, for example, the principal economies in East Asia, China, Japan, South Korea. As those economies have, or as those governments of those countries have promised to get to net zero carbon emissions, you realize they're going to rely more and more on LNG. And here you see an increase of electrification through still a hydrocarbon, gas. Whether LNG is a bridge to a future of LNG will be here for at least a couple of decades, if not much longer, or be a permanent part of the energy mix. So as the energy mix, as I'm saying, gets larger, the energy pie essentially that is required is larger because of the economies growing and demanding more electrification. I see oil, for example, remaining at more or less 100 million barrels a day, give or take 10 million barrels or so. But its share of the mix will increase. But on a absolute basis, the market will still remain more or less around that number. You'll see greater increases in LNG. You'll see obviously the photovoltaics and the solar and other wind and other sources of electricity coming online. So with putting those all together, I'll close with one last question here, is to make the infrastructure for electricity available. You need, California, for example, alone needs about $1 trillion of investment to make electrification possible for a net zero economy and no internal combustion engines in 2030. That's $1 trillion. Every other country around the world will have to make similar types of investments. I'm going to end with one question. What government around the world will have the financial ability to make those investments now that everybody's been essentially spent themselves into the poorhouse because of COVID? So I started off with COVID. I'm ending with COVID, but with a question that how will the projections work over the future with a post-COVID economy with governments strapped for cash? So thank you, Rusha. I think I've taken up enough of your time. I'd love to take as many questions as possible.
Thank you, Sheikh Nawaf. That was excellent. We do have a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I thank our audience for being interactive with us and submitting their questions. So the first question that we have comes to us from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, do you envisage the GCC countries, given their geography, climate, etc., could position themselves in the future to become the net exporter of electricity derived from solar, similar to Australia, to become the hub of renewable energy exports? And if so, what actions need to be taken now to secure that position?
Well, I think that export of electricity is actually not as easy as you might. You can't really hear electricity except through wires, and you lose power very quickly the longer your wires are. So it's not really an export of electricity, but you probably might think of an export of energy derived from electricity. So it might be hydrogen, and the way it's produced is very simple. You run electricity through water, and you separate the hydrogen and oxygen molecules, and you create oxygen and hydrogen. And if you're able to condense that, liquefy it, put it, then you have to develop a new infrastructure for that. I know that Saudi Arabia is doing something like that, and they've announced that they're doing that. I think that's going to be done in association with NEOM, the new industrial hub, and it is a good opportunity for the Gulf states if we can generate cheap electricity. The problem right now is most of our electricity is generated through either natural gas or, even worse, through occasional uses of crude oil in power generation. So if you're able to generate electricity through solar, and God knows we have enough sunshine days in the Gulf to be able to capitalize on that. The problem that we have, though, on that is of course, that photovoltaics don't work as efficiently in our region because of the dust that settles upon them, even after one day after cleaning a solar panel. It loses about 50% of its efficiency because of dust. So if we were able to figure out how to maintain efficiency of solar, to a less extent wind in the region, but certainly on the solar side, that would be a possibility. And I think the UAE, I know, is working on this as well. And we'll need to wait and see what they come up with and how successful they are.
The next question comes to us from Silan. She's asking, though the overall crude prices started to position back to its original levels and climbing up in short term via the recovered demand, how do you elaborate the current production structure, the refineries in particular, and how do you see these heavy investments to transform in the future or more efficiently utilize, considered the new energy mix?
I mean, refining has been in essentially the gutter before COVID, even and through COVID, even worse, and doesn't look, unfortunately, like it's going to recover anytime quickly. Certainly not as fast as the oil prices recovered. Refining margins have been horrendous. They've been negative in many places around the world. We've seen that through our refineries in KPI, although we have a refinery, we're a joint venture partner in a refinery in Vietnam that is actually well positioned through a better refining margin than almost any other refinery in the region, but still is suffering through low refining margins. I don't see the refining margins recovering very quickly, at least in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. And that is going to be quite challenging to companies that have that refining capacity, and especially since you're going to see additional refineries coming online. One in Kuwait, for example, at 615,000 barrels a day. You have another one coming in Nigeria, the Dangote one. Saudi Arabia just started one. There's a lot of refining capacity coming on. We have one coming in with our partners in Oman. It's going to challenge the market. You're going to see a lot of refineries, less efficient refineries, fourth quartile, third quartile, even starting to shut down.
Next question comes to us from an anonymous attendee. What do you envisage to be the role of energy storage, large-scale batteries in the MENA region?
Storage is actually quite interesting because I mentioned the issues about lithium, cobalt. I mentioned even now one of the storage options for long term is hydro or even hydrogen. And I mentioned the green and the blue hydrogen, the green being full and blue coming production coming out of it, and the gray that is what most of us know is essential hydrogen production that has been conventional for many years. I think hydrogen is going to be one of the principal player here in terms of energy storage, because batteries are quite expensive, still quite expensive, and quite cumbersome. So we build a hydrogen economy in the Gulf. I think that would be quite beneficial for all of us. The rest is just too easy. I mean, we in the Gulf, as you all know, are at the low end of the cost curve for hydrocarbons production, for oil production. That's why we will produce well beyond anybody else's ability to maintain a market share. We will always be around producing. We are also, more importantly, at the low end of the carbon cost curve. So our production of a barrel of oil is much lower in carbon intensity than any other barrel around the world. So even from a climate perspective, our oil will be the last barrel produced on Earth. So between the ease of producing hydrocarbons and using those for electricity, and also the potential for hydrogen coming out of other sources of electrification, we should be well positioned to capture that future.
Perfect. We have time for one last question. Do you think Kuwait should lead in integrating carbon neutral energy and developing reserves? And would Kuwait use solar from steam injected in EOR operations, or is it still not a reliable source for EOR operations?
Well, actually, what I find very interesting for EOR operations, that's enhanced oil recovery. That's the type of mechanisms that oil producers will use to maximize production from an oil field as pressure drops over time, or you need to sweep oil through a reservoir to produce it. Traditionally, we've used gas injection to stimulate and to maintain reservoir pressure to produce oil. We've also used water to help sweep. Both of those are actually quite expensive. Gas, obviously, for obvious reasons, would otherwise be used for power generation, and water is a very expensive resource in our region, in the Gulf in particular. So it's also not good to use fresh water for that use. So one of the things that we should all be experimenting on, and this is going to add to the longevity of Gulf produced oil over time, is the ability to inject CO2. Right now, the technology exists on a rudimentary scale. You can inject CO2 into a reservoir to maintain its pressure, although that increases the cost of producing your barrel of oil by about $30 to $35. So it is not economic in any sense right now. But as technology develops and people find more innovative ways to inject carbon CO2 into a reservoir to maintain that pressure, first of all, you free up the gas and the water that you would otherwise be using for that. And also you are removing through CCUS, which is carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, you would be removing CO2 from what would otherwise go into the atmosphere and injecting that. So it's a double whammy, if you will. You get two benefits out of that's, I think, what we should be concentrating most of our R&D on through steam injection. For steam injection, as the question was, you need water for that, and it is still a finite and expensive resource.
Sheikh Nawaf Sabah, thank you so much for your time. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of the questions. There are some great questions in the Q&A box. Hopefully, we'll try to get to them after our roundtable discussion. Again, thank you, Sheikh Nawaf, for your time. Moving on now to our roundtable. Thank you. Moving on now to our roundtable, we have 3 experts for you tonight to talk about our theme of this evening. Our first guest joins us from the UAE and has been called the LNG Queen. Sarah Behbehani is the Managing Director at BEnergy Solutions, and more importantly, an LBS alumni. Sarah Behbehani is an experienced energy leader with an exceptional global network. Previous tasks included establishing the LNG desk at GERA Global Markets. She was responsible for building the overall LNG desk structure, including recruiting talent, leading the overall LNG growth strategy, and oversight of training, optimization, and risk management. Sarah has more than 20 years of experience in oil and LNG trading and marketing, and has served roles in Kuwait, London, Dubai, and Singapore. She's passionate about diversity in trading teams and led the female community in LNG. She graduated with a degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering from the United States and then obtained an MBA from London Business School. Next, we have Omran Al-Kuwari, who is the CEO of Qatar Foundation International. Prior to joining Qatar Foundation, Omran held several key leadership positions in various organizations, such as Qatar Gas, Qatar Petroleum, ExxonMobil, Green Gulf, and Enterprise Qatar, as well as the role of economic advisor to the Minister of Economy and Commerce. Omran holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from George Washington University and a master's degree in business administration from City University, which we won't hold against him here at LBS. He is currently a doctoral researcher at UCL's Institute for Sustainable Resources, where he is researching decarbonization in the era of climate change, with a particular focus on natural gas and hydrogen. Our final panelist in the roundtable joins us from the UAE as well. Igor Hulak is a partner at Kearney and is mainly responsible for supporting clients active in the resources and energy value chain in both private and public sectors across the MEA region. He is a member of the global leadership team of the Energy and Process Industry Practice and is global leader of the Metals and Mining segment. Igor has managed large-scale strategic and business transformation programs for leading companies in the oil and gas, metals and mining, utilities, infrastructure, technology, and manufacturing sectors in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa in both private and public sectors. Welcome, dear guests, and let's start with the first question and talk about the pandemic and the impact that it has had on the energy transition. So the first question is, how has COVID impacted the decade of delivery for the oil and gas industry, and has it accelerated the energy transition? So this question is open to any of our panelists who'd like to answer this. Igor, your camera is still off. Yes, and you are muted, just in case. Okay, so what do you think has the impact of COVID been? Has it accelerated the transition?
I could take this quick comment, if that's okay. Yeah, I think first of all, I'd like to extend my condolences to the family of Sheikh Zaki Yamani, who passed away today, who's a legend in the energy world and especially in our region. So I'd like to say may he rest in peace. But just to answer, to make comment on that point, you know, Sheikh Nawaf made a lot of comments around this, and I think all excellent comments. I'd maybe pick on a few other angles. I think when COVID-19 first happened, I think the common view was that energy transition will slow down, and you know things there will be projects delayed, and decarbonization efforts will slow down, and so on. And we did see some projects, some large scale, especially in the region, solar projects, capital projects delayed, and so on. But in general, I mean, in terms of policy, in terms of signaling, in terms of decarbonization targets for companies as well as countries, we've seen a lot of movement. Net zero countries like Japan and China have announced it during this period. We've seen IOCs announce major kind of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 targets, net zero targets, all in this period within since COVID-19 started. I mean, there was some before, but the momentum continued. So I think, what it will actually translate to is hard to say, but I think what we can say is that COVID-19 did not slow down the momentum. And in many cases, other events happen that can see it used as a way to accelerate things. And specifically in MENA, I think COVID-19, it will affect us slightly differently than other regions. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected government's abilities to diversify. The revenues related to the slowdown in oil prices, although it's picking up now, oil and gas prices, that has definitely affected some diversification efforts. But at the same time, and there's other things that are related to, as Sheikh Nawaf alluded to, if the COVID-19 will accelerate some of the energy transition kind of efforts, then maybe there'll be opportunity for the oil and gas producers in the region in the short term to fill that gap. So it's hard to tell what will happen in MENA specifically in the short to medium term, but I think it's safe to say that it did not slow down the energy transition. In fact, it accelerated some parts of it during this period.
Igor, you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, just Rusha, and thank you. I would just add that definitely I agree that we had a destination of the energy transition before COVID, and the destination is still the same, but the pace has changed. And I would say that particularly for us in Middle East region, the energy transition also represents an opportunity, enormous opportunity, how to diversify the economies. And we are gifted not only by oil, or we have been gifted by the oil resources, but also the other resources, solar, or sun and wind. And some of the countries enjoys one of the largest or best irradiations in the world. And how we can use it to diversify also to non-oil revenues, and to use that is I think a big opportunity for the countries in the Middle East region.
So you said that it had an impact, but do you think that it'll have the pandemic and the associated dump slump will have long-term impact on the strategy of these companies in the region? So do you think that it'll have long-term impact?
I definitely think that all the, if you are asking about the champions, the local champions within the Middle East region, the companies or the NOCs, they have two roles to play. One of them is to, of course, being the champions of the oil and gas sector, but also the transformational role for the countries. And the impact, Sheikh quite nicely described some of the trends and opinions about whether the oil will really decrease or how the demand and supply will play out. Equally, the COVID brought many questions, and the really exposed the climate change issue. And as it was mentioned by many of us, that we started to think about what is the really size of the climate change problem. And the acceleration or the pace of the renewable energy or green energy will accelerate, and the local companies, local NOCs in the MENA region or in the Middle East region will have a very big role to play. I'm not aware of any who wouldn't have a significant portion of their strategies focusing on the clean energy. Whether you look into the Saudi Arabia, what is happening with Saudi Aramco, hydrogen was mentioned, the cooperation with Hyundai about the hydrogen use in the transportation, one of the very progressive projects. Another one in the hydrogen with the futuristic city NEOM also was mentioned. All of these are getting integral part of the strategies of the companies, and that cannot be ignored.
Okay,
yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just to add a point on that. I think the national oil company, international oil company discussion is hugely important, not just for a region, for the world. I think many don't realize maybe that over 85% of reserves are actually in national oil companies. hands, and a big part of that obviously is in MENA. So I think that's at the same time you have different drivers. IOCs have they're being pushed to change by shareholder engagement and pressure from shareholders to change. I think what's going to happen in NOCs, what we're seeing is, as Igor mentioned, that they're changing, they're including clean energy, but I think it's not because they have to, their stakeholders are forcing them to. I think it's a way of mitigating risk long term. So they're balancing out what they need to do in terms of short term, maximizing revenue because they have a national responsibility. But at the same time, they're getting involved in clean energy because it's a way to manage risk and to also make sure that they can maximize it in terms of length and timing, not just of short-term revenue. So it's interesting how clean energy and climate kind of strategy has moved from being something you should kind of have to do to become business strategy, and something NOCs are doing because it makes sense for them on a case-by-case basis. Very different from an IOC perspective. So that's why you see different pace of development depending on the regional NOC we're talking about.
Okay, so let's build on mitigating risk, and let me invite Sarah to join us as from her role as a consultant in the region. Sarah, what's your opinion on how organizational leaders approach risk assessment? How do they build resilience and manage the impact of COVID-19 and climate change?
Well, I think every organization, especially in COVID, had inward thinking and revision of how they manage their teams. I've been in trading all my life, and there is a lot of misconception that you cannot trade unless you are in the trading floor. You cannot have part-time trading. You can't have flexible hours. And of course, you always need to be on the road. We saw all that change. I don't think a lot of revenue dropped in any organization because they've been working from home. Also resilience in terms of like checking on people, having a lot of connection in terms of activity online, trying to be more humane and really caring, are you okay? Talking a lot about the mental health during the pandemic, and it's become part of the discussion, focusing more on emotional intelligence and how empathy versus the IQ. There's a lot of things in the many organizations I've been with, and I see the changes, also including bringing more diversity, bringing more openness, and not only the, let's say, about the money, but how is this money being delivered from their people? So a lot of changes has been happening for sure with this COVID.
Okay, so let's move on to carbon emissions. How is low carbon transition disrupting fossil fuels, and what will post-2050 look like for upstream oil and gas?
I think this is like a very popular subject right now. Everybody's having all these big targets of carbon neutrality. And if you look in most of the people, I would say there's a lot of talk on the what, less so on the how. And I think even with the Middle East, we see a lot of talking about hydrogen, which is very early stages in terms of like development as a transition fuel. But there is more steps to be done today on carbon capture, how you emission, how you do your exploration, how you transport your cargoes using, for example, LNG versus marine diesel oil. These are steps you can do today, next 2 years, versus let's talk about hydrogen, which the technology is still very, very young, and we have all these great targets. Although 2050 is quite far, but for example, China, to be carbon neutral in 2050 or 60, they need to peak oil at 2025. I don't think this is happening in 2025. We see China still burning coal, and then they said coal was peaking at 2013, but we saw a rise in coal in 2017. So it's all good. We see a lot of money thrown at it, but I don't think it's, we are not there yet. There's nothing serious to change that, let's say, carbon emission.
Omran, is there anything you'd like to add about that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to a certain extent, I agree a lot with what Sarah said. I think is a lot of hype and a lot of, I think, like I mentioned before, it's because a lot of these companies are forced to announce something. A lot of these countries, COP26 coming, and the how part is a big point. But I think in terms of MENA, Sheikh Nawaf alluded to this too. I think one thing, there's the extreme kind of carbon capture, hydrogen, fully decarbonized verticals we're talking about, but there's a lot of things in the middle, and one of those things can be actually the carbon intensity of the different oil and gas that's being produced or going to be produced. And I think that's a competitive advantage for a lot of the MENA-based exporters. We don't actually, and not yet really in a tangible way, or carbon intensity is not rewarded in terms of lower carbon intensity in different countries as importers or exporters. I think eventually, and you see some kind of discussions around this, that producers are trying to differentiate themselves, that lower carbon intensity products, oil or gas, should be treated differently. And that in itself will create a whole new stream of activities around measurement and making sure we're transparent around how we manage we measure the carbon greenhouse gas emissions and so on. But then eventually that will actually create a competitive advantage for MENA. So I think emissions is not just about net zero. Like Sarah mentioned, there's so much that can be done between, whether you're talking about the LNG chain, whether you're talking about sources of the oil, with the shale gas versus, Saudi gas, oil, for example. There's a lot of differences and impact, and that can have significant impact on how countries measure their emissions as importers too, which have actually probably matter more in the near term than some of these other announcements that we see.
Okay, so let's move to clean energy. And how do you think companies are integrating climate into their investment strategies? Igor, would you like to start us off on that one? How are companies integrating climate in their investment strategies?
Yeah, we already touched upon this, and this is when you look at the IOCs or all majors, you would see that there's an integral part of their strategy. So their investment strategy is completely changing their portfolios, and the wave of announcement of the European IOCs about how they are going to tackle that and making it part of their strategies is, I would say, on one hand remarkable, but also interesting in terms of the horizons. How they want to achieve it, and they are acting on it. The same. Usually, the experience is that the NOCs usually follow IOCs, and that when we look into Middle East region, again going back to the local champions, more or less in every country of Middle East or MENA, you would hardly find any of the NOCs who wouldn't have this as a part of their integral strategies going forward. The clean energy, whether it's the renewables, whether it's hydrogen that we already spoke about. What is interesting also to mention is that how it is filtering into the organization operating or business models, that you actually see now that these are the created departments or the divisions of the companies, that the clean energy is becoming part of the investment decision making of the companies, that the management of the companies, their targets, or actually even their bonuses, are linked to these criteria. So this is changing, and this is getting into day-to-day life of the companies.
Sarah, you want to add?
Yes, well, I think everybody, I think I read somewhere there's like 10 to 40 billion, no, I think $40 billion between the top 6 IOCs has been pledged against carbon zero. BP was very more aggressive, saying they are shutting down all their complex oil production, and they will keep the, let's say, more profitable oil exploration. And I think Exxon has been pledged for the first time ever. BP had a bit of sort of, after their deep water, they have reduced their green investment, and now they are doubling down. So we see, and I think Total have announced they want to be #1 in renewable energy as well. We see a lot of them, I think, in every reshape or strategy from the all IOC, banks as well. Financing has now very aggressively, if you don't have green policy, they might not finance you with advantageous rates. So you see it across the value chain. Even investors, the shareholders are asking the IOCs to have more, let's say, serious steps toward not just putting them in their announcement. So indeed, there is a lot of more serious investment toward that.
Yeah, Rusha, if I may, just Sarah mentioned very important point in the area of funding and financiers actually increasing the pressure on the companies, and this has been a phenomenon of the past months or a couple of years as well. But there is it's going even deeper into the supply chain for some of the suppliers or technology suppliers who are actually maybe planning to supply, or who are the vendors of the technologies for the projects that don't have a reputation of being environmental friendly. They are being hit by various activists, by the financiers. So it is getting much deeper than just the investment strategic plans. It is getting into the day-to-day operational life of the companies.
Omran, is there anything you'd like to add to this, or shall we move on to the next question?
No, nothing. I mean, the panelists covered it well.
All right, so the next question we have, and this will be the last question before we move on to the live Q&A from the audience. Sorry, just a second. Will today's NOCs look at becoming energy companies? I mean, Sarah mentioned this briefly in regard to Total. So converting from oil and gas to renewables, green, blue hydrogen. What do you think, what are your predictions for the national companies in the Gulf region in this regard?
Well, I think during the transformation even in the oil side, IOC become closer to the national oil company, and national oil company goes closer to the IOC. I think they go to the middle and trying to adopt each other. I think it's the only way to go, because it's the evolution of this whole industry. You go from heavy oil to light oil, and then I think to gas. I think gas will be a huge participant in the energy transition, and I think it will be having a foundation to expedite the energy transition. MENA, I think they are blessed by having one of the cheapest oil, I think, to produce. And I think if they have investment around it in terms of doing less emission, they will be lasting another 50, 70 years, maybe more. So, but I think a lot of it, they will diversify in investment. You can see like wind, solar, even acquiring electric company, maybe overseas. So we will see everybody's going to everyone else's area, and I think they will become the same.
Maybe if I can, Rusha, I see one more important element of in the Middle East for NOCs and going into the area of the clean energy and renewables. And every country, if you take one by one in the Middle East or in GCC, have targets for diversification of the economy or non-oil revenues. And the expansion of NOCs into these areas, into the clean energy renewable, is also a way how to diversify. And NOCs are playing a very important role in these economies to diversify, to help the industrialization and to grow the technologies that may not be the oil-dependent technologies. And that is a very important role for NOCs in every country in GCC or even in MENA to play. And there was a question to Sheikh Nawaf about exporting the energy or exporting electricity. I fully agree with what Sheikh mentioned, even though there are big plans even to export the electricity from Sahara region up north to Europe. However, I believe that GCC or Middle East have a potential, and with some of the big mega projects, very successful projects for example, in Saudi Arabia, has a potential to become an exporter of the technology in the renewables energies, in the clean energy in the region, with the projects that are hitting the record lows in the levelized cost of electricity, either in solar or wind. For example, Saudi Arabia, that is experience that is being built, and some of the champions are already being born with the companies like Aquapower and some others. So there is an important underlying role of NOCs also to help with the non-oil revenue diversification.
I think just to add to both of those, if I may, I mean, at the end of the day, NOCs are in a unique position. They have to leverage, they have to utilize the assets they have. You know, each country has their own. So each will try to adapt their business model based on what they can leverage. So for example, if you're Qatar, you're going to try to be the lowest cost LNG provider, least carbon. If you're Saudi Arabia, then you can start looking at large scale hydrogen production, whether it's blue or green, because you have the capacity. In all scenarios, even 2040, 2045, Saudi hydrogen, green or blue, is cheaper than any hydrogen produced in Germany in many examples. So I think each NOC by nature has to minimize the risk of stranding their assets, you can say, and then aligning that with the transition. And that's, I think, the way to look at it from an NOC perspective, or else it's a very different paradigm, NOC versus IOC.
Thank you, everyone. So now we'll move on to our questions from the audience. The first question comes to us from Shalindra. Shalindra asks, refined product market growth is forecasted mainly in Asia, whereas all exporters are competing for the same market. Besides, new mega refinery investments is also likely expected in Asia. In this situation, how do you foresee the refining business for exported-oriented refineries from Middle East? Okay, shall we move on to the next question then? If we don't have a comment on it. Okay, so the next question comes to us from Jamil. Jamil is asking, all renewable technologies are mineral intensive, and World Bank estimates increase in demand by 500% for minerals and metals. Do you think the mining value chain has a place in the GCC to diversify into mining, processing raw materials to feed into manufacturing renewable technology in the region?
I don't have a lot of experience in mining, but I don't think that's, I never talked to someone that was a focus area, let's say, in the companies I was talking about with around the subject. So I don't know if Omran have another view.
I mean, I think it's a global issue that everyone, especially actually interestingly with COVID-19, it's kind of brought to the forefront this idea of looking at supply chain and trying to, putting in the forefront energy security and resilience, and looking at the entire supply chain. And when you're looking at new supply chains that are coming up, such as lithium batteries and so on, and I think specifically when majority of that comes from China, I think many countries, many regions are trying to understand, reconcile how to manage that and how to differ from that. So definitely MENA and the Gulf exporters having the capital to kind of create mining arms or explore that. Even in a lot in countries like Saudi Arabia, of course, have a lot of resources. I think there's definitely room for MENA countries to play in that and to kind of maybe alter the trajectory of how it was going before COVID and before even other concerns around COVID and free trade was coming with Trump administration and so on. So yes, I mean, I think there was big scope for MENA exporters, MENA players to play in that.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. The next question comes to us from Simona. Simona is asking, is it a complex task to cap the fossil oil extraction? Is it because of that we are still pumping oil, or is it not possible to cap the operating or live oil wells? So the question is regarding the transition. So why aren't we stopping, and why are we not stopping these live oil wells?
I think that's a very aspirational question. There is, and do what? I think goes back and we ride horses. People need to fly. I think we all want to be green, but let's be honest, like there is no way there is renewable, even with Europe, the most advanced economy, who started the Industrial Revolution, and now they can afford to be nuclear and wind and everything. They still need fossil fuel. There is not enough even oil in the world to fulfill all the growth. So let's not talk about renewable or even gas. So we are not there into the world's self-sufficiency in terms of energy. Technology, even for batteries, are not nowhere even 5% for the world demand in terms of energy. So I think one day, maybe, but not yet.
Okay, the next question is a challenging question. And the anonymous submitter says, it seems that there is less genuine innovation in renewables in the Middle East than there might have been expected. What major success stories are there? So can we give them any evidence that there is genuine renewable interest and initiatives in the Middle East that we want to have come through? Omran?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Middle East has been a bit behind in terms of renewable development, but I think one very important factor, I'm not sure if it's, you qualify as innovation or not, but I think the 3 of the 4 lowest cost large scale solar projects in history have been in the region in the last year. I think started UAE, then Qatar, and I think now also Saudi Arabia. I mean, the prices we're seeing now, and you could say it's innovation and structuring the project and financing and scale and combining different technologies. You can say that, but definitely one area where MENA can say it's playing a major role in renewables is getting the cost down to a level that was never, thought believable 5 years ago. So I think, you'll see. I think there was around 5 gigawatts of solar that was supposed to be built in 2020 that is getting delayed. I think that will be built, and then probably, 10 times more of that in the next 3 or 4 years after that. So I think MENA was slow, but also that delay. When I say MENA, I mean the Gulf mostly. But I think it benefited from that kind of delay in the terms of getting the cost down. And also, it also benefited from a lot of the lessons learned from Masdar and UAE in terms of technological know-how and how to adapt to high heat and sand and so on, as we mentioned earlier. So I think it's around bringing the cost down to a level where it's just competitive with any gas-fired power, for example, produced domestically in many countries.
Yeah, I would. Maybe if I can add, depends on what we really mean by genuine. I would respectfully argue that when you look at the projections of the growth of renewables in MENA region, it's nearly double of the global, and it's a really steep curve that is going up. And with the successes or with the successful projects Omran already mentioned, and the recorded world lows in the levelized cost of electricity on some of the wind and solar projects in Saudi Arabia, and very bold moves and statements about some of the mega projects, whether NEOM or others, they are giving very clear statements about way forward on the renewables and clean energy. This is also I think underlined by what Omran mentioned, that there are some companies already being at the level of the world players, or as a minimum as a regional players that can really develop these projects from end to end and be significant players, which is very important as well. So depends on what we mean by genuine or how we define genuine. I would argue that many players in the renewable energies are putting their eyes on the Middle East region and the plans for the renewables.
Okay, so building on that and innovations and renewables and genuine, so let's talk about carbon emissions. Now, as you know, during this, simultaneously with the Global Energy Summit that's happening this week, we also have the International Petroleum Week, and what's expected from the majors attending during this week is commitments to carbon emissions, and similar to what we discussed with the countries and their commitments to carbon neutrality. So Sharma is asking, in the Middle East, what's the plans in regards to carbon emission commitments from the Gulf countries and the Gulf country companies?
Well, I will try for that one. I don't know what's I mean, I cannot speak on the behalf of the NOC, but I think Sheikh Nawaf as well mentioned, and we have mentioned that there is initiative in the MENA region without these commitments. They are not part of the announcement of the Paris Agreement, but they are doing it, although they are the lowest cost of oil and gas in the world. So, so I think it's just, is it announcing I want to be net zero in 2060 when most people are dead anyway? It doesn't mean anything if you're not doing anything about it. So from the Paris Agreement, the first time they did it till now, almost no one is on target. But they announced it. They all announced it, all OECD countries. So I think announcing and burning the bill doesn't mean anything. But the MENA region do, and trying to do, whether it's Masdar or I think Qatar, they had in the World Cup will be zero carbon, and they are trying the last couple of contracts and trying to track the carbon emission. ADNOC, I think they developed a way to have tracking that carbon emission. They are doing stuff without these kind of big announcements. So I think that should be appreciated.
Maybe just to mention, announcement, as Sarah mentioned, are one thing, the actions second, but there are announcements in the region. Saudi Arabia announced the plan to reduce the emissions by 130 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030. As part of their G20 presidency to embrace these targets and to go for 4 hours. And some of the projects, and we would repeat ourselves, like NEOM is the, if realized or when realized, then they will be the largest projects for hydrogen. And these are big targets.
Okay. Next question. In yesterday's session, one of the speakers mentioned that Jaguar are only going to be producing electrical cars starting 2025. Some countries have announced target dates for a complete ban on the sale of internal combustion engines. So what do you see as the future of the internal combustion engine, especially with interest to the Middle East producing countries?
Yeah, I mean, if I could jump in, I mean, obviously, I think road transport represents around 18 to 20% of global emissions. So it's going to be a huge area of focus. And a lot of that obviously is fuel. So fuel oil, so it's going to be an important issue. It depends on how fast, oil gets, electric vehicles move. And it depends on a lot of the whole chain of availability of all the different kind of minerals and so on to scale up to this, the scale needed. But in some forecasts, I saw that by 2050 in a 2-degree world, it could be up to 15 to 20 million of barrels of oil per day displaced, which is really a really high amount. So I think it's an important issue to look at. But also you have to also break down transport. And also we've seen with COVID-19 some different areas within transport. Personal mobility is different than personal transport. Then you have long haul transport, where hydrogen can play a role. So I think it depends on where the investment and where the policies go on the different types of chain. But definitely it's going to be a huge focus for the developing countries who import oil specifically, and that will have knock-on effect on exporting countries. So that there's similar parallels to plastics, by the way, not quite the same, but plastics also is an important area of focus because there's no clear alternatives yet, but the impact on displacement will be huge.
I think the UK has said there is no new cars will be fossil fuel, but anybody who have already a car, that will be okay to be fossil fuel. I think Europe will be the first one to move toward electric cars. I would see India already have using gas in some of the vehicles. China will be a big shifter of how they decide to do this, whether they will shift from internal combustion to hydrogen, or they will go to electricity. So it's not there yet that the electric car have won the race yet, because in Asia they are trying as well with the hydrogen. So yeah, I think this one we'll have to see.
Always the question is whether and how quickly it will come to us in Middle East region. And when you look into Europe, Scandinavia, I think the main Scandinavian countries last year, new car sales was ranging between 20 to even, if I remember well, 70–80% being electric vehicles, with Norway leading. How quickly this is going to happen in Middle East region or even Middle East Africa region is of course a question. When you look at the facts and all the predictions, the ICE technology will still play a significant role in 5–10 years period. Does it mean that it is a technology for the future or going beyond? It's a question. The electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, this seems to be the technology going forward.
All right, so we only have time for one quick question, and it's a fun question that we got from an anonymous participant asking, would you invest in Exxon or BP, Shell, and Total?
Yeah, I will invest
Personal
in
opinion.
Exxon. I will invest, no, not in Exxon. I will invest in Shell and BP for my, I think these are, and Total as well. They are there, they are agile. I think they are already resetting their strategy. Shell has shifted their asset base from oil to heavy gas 4 or 5 years ago. So yeah, I would definitely invest.
I would depend. It depends on the time scale, because there's a scenario Sheikh Nawaf mentioned where to be undersupply, and some of these companies like Conoco or Shell are really trying to be the last man standing type of approach, where they want to be the cheapest, most effective. So maybe there might be some opportunities in the short term, but long term, I agree with Sarah that the more diversified ones seem to be a safer bet. I would not invest in Bitcoin today, that's for sure. Based on what I'm seeing.
I'm invested in Bitcoin. It's fine.
My phone's going off the hooks. Not a good day, but yeah. So I would agree with Sarah long term.
Okay, Igor, invest, not invest. You're on mute, Igor.
My apology. I was hoping that you would omit me by nature of my profession. I am not allowed to give the investment advices. But what I can say is that the plans announced by these companies are very, very interesting. It will be the years ahead of us to really watch how the plans that they have will be realized. So.
Oh yeah, and disclaimer, I'm not an investment advisor, so please don't follow my advice.
And I own no energy stocks, zero. So I thought I'd say that too.
Thank you very much to our dear panelists. That's all the time we have this evening. I'd like to thank our speakers for their contributions, and I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for your time and your active participation with your great questions. I apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them. I'd also like to thank LBS Energy and Environment Club for all their behind-the-scene efforts to organize this virtual summit. It's not easy as we made it look. So don't forget to join the final day of the summit tomorrow at 1900. And now I'll turn the virtual stage to Abdelrazak Al-Badr. Thank you.
Thank you, Rusha. Before we conclude the event, we will be sharing with you a survey in the chat. We would really appreciate it if you could give us your feedback on the event. Also, I'd like to thank our speakers for their valuable insights on the future of energy in the Middle East, and would like to thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening. Please join us tomorrow, where we'll discuss the market trends and growth in distributed solar energy, as well as how to tackle the world's energy storage challenges by considering a variety of technology solutions. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.